The village clung to the mountainside like a stubborn patch of moss, its slate roofs slick with the breath of the clouds. Morning and night were twins here, for the mist never lifted fully. It wrapped around the crooked lanes, curled through half-shut windows, and seeped into the bones of those who had known no other sky. Even the sun, when it dared to show itself, appeared only as a pale coin pressed against a veil, and the moon was little more than a smudge in the darkness. In such a place, shadows did not wait for night to be born. They lived and moved in daylight, whispering in corners where no wind blew. It was said the village had been built on the edge of an older world, where bargains were struck not with coin but with pieces of the soul. The elders would shake their heads at such talk, insisting the past was gone, but the children knew better. They told stories in hurried voices, glancing at doorways as if afraid their words might draw something listening. Chief among those tales was the one about the Market of Eyes. According to the whispers, once every few decades, strangers would come to the village during the last harvest moon, carrying chests lined with velvet and promises lined with lies. They would offer silver enough to buy a dozen farms, or jewels bright enough to light a room in exchange for eyes, not glass ones, not carved ones, but the very eyes from a living face. No one claimed to have seen such a market themselves, but there were names of villagers who had once been young and sharp-eyed and had lived the rest of their years fumbling in the dark. Some said they had been tricked, others claimed they had given up their sight willingly for beauty, for riches, for the kind of power that could turn a neighbor into a servant with a single glance. It was, the children believed, a bargain steeped in greed, and greed here was not rare. For the village had a sickness of the heart. They prized beauty as though it were the only coin worth keeping, and wealth as though it could cure every ill. Mothers scolded daughters who came in from the fields with sunburnt faces. Fathers frowned at sons whose hands were calloused rather than clean. Mirrors were polished more often than floors. The worth of a person was measured by the shine of their hair, the symmetry of their features, the cut of their clothes. Envy was as common as bread, baked fresh every day and shared without shame. The mist seemed to thicken when such thoughts passed between people, as though it could taste their hunger and fed upon it. Now and then, a stranger would pause at the edge of the main square, their gaze lingering on some particularly fine-featured youth, and the air would grow heavier, pressing against the lungs. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt it, the slow turning of a wheel that ground innocence into dust. And in that village lived a girl whose eyes were said to catch the smallest flicker of truth, even when hidden behind the politest smile. She had no mirror more than a shard of glass in her home, no gold but the warmth in her voice, yet her gaze made liars falter and boasters shift uncomfortably. Those who loved her called her gift a blessing. Those who envied her called it dangerous. No one knew, least of all the girl herself, that the mist was already watching her, curling fingers of shadow toward her window, marking her for a trade that would one day be written in the unblinking eyes of the market. Long before she could dream of what she might lose, the mountains had already decided her fate. Mira had been born on a morning when the mist was so thick it muffled even the church bell, and her mother used to joke that she had been shaped by silence. But Myra's world was anything but quiet. She noticed everything. The twitch in a man's jaw when he swallowed a lie, the way two sisters avoided each other's gaze after an argument, the faint scent of crushed rosemary that lingered on a neighbor's hands though he swore he hadn't been near her herb garden. Her eyes were quick, bright, and unsettling in their stillness, as if they were more mirror than flesh. Her father, before he died, had told her that some people carried their hearts in their eyes, and that hers had been built to read them. It was not a gift she tried to sharpen, yet it sharpened itself, as natural to her as breathing. When she was a child, she would sit in the square and watch faces instead of games, noting how joy looked different when it was true, how sadness could be faked to win sympathy, how anger often hid fear. By the time she was grown, the whole village knew. You could try to lie to Mira, but you wouldn't get far. This gift was both her blessing and her curse. It brought her into people's lives at their most vulnerable. She knew when the widow's cough was worse than she admitted, and she would bring her warm broth before anyone else thought to. She could tell when a man was pretending to be sober, and she would walk him home before he stumbled into the well. She noticed when a child's laughter was brittle, and she would slip the little one a handful of berries to sweeten their day. But the same eyes that caught pain also caught deceit, and deceit did not like being seen. There were whispers, soft at first, then louder, that Mira was not entirely human. Some said she had made a bargain with the mist itself, trading something unnamed for her strange sight. Others claimed her gaze could curse a person, stripping the gloss from their luck. People thanked her with their mouths and avoided her with their eyes. Still, Mira carried herself with a gentle steadiness. She worked in the small weaving shop her aunt owned, her fingers quick and sure, her patterns balanced like sunlight and shadow. On days when the work was slow, she wandered the riverbank, letting her thoughts drift with the current. It was on one such day, near the place where the water narrowed between two black stones, that she saw it. The light was poor, there was always too much mist for clear sunlight, but something flashed beneath the surface. At first she thought it a trick of the water, but then it glimmered again, faint but insistent. Mira waded in, the cold biting her calves, and reached down into the river's whispering rush. Her fingers closed around something smooth, warm despite the water, and heavier than she expected. When she pulled it free, she saw it was a gemstone, larger than any she had imagined could exist outside of a noble's vault. It was not cut or polished, but it shone from within, a deep gold light that pulsed faintly as if alive. Mira turned it over in her hand, marveling at its weight, the way it seemed to hum in her palm. She had never been one to covet wealth, but she could not deny the strange pull it had on her. She thought of taking it to the village elders, but something in her resisted. The gemstone felt private, as though it had chosen her. She slipped it into the small leather pouch she wore beneath her skirt and walked home without telling a soul. But secrets are never truly alone in a village like theirs. Perhaps someone had seen her wading in the river, perhaps the gemstone's faint glow had been noticed from afar. Or perhaps it was simply that the air changes around a person who carries something rare. In the days that followed, Mira felt eyes on her. At first, it was only a prickling at the back of her neck, the kind one can dismiss as imagination. Then came the lingering glances in the square, the too casual questions about where she'd been, the way conversations would stop when she entered a room. By the week's end, the whispers had begun in earnest. She heard her name paired with words like treasure and fortune in corners she passed. She caught the butcher's wife staring at her hands as though expecting them to drip gold. Strangers in the market seemed to follow her from stall to stall. The mist had always been part of the village, but now it felt heavier, closer, curling around her like a predator's breath. Mira told herself it was nothing. But deep down she knew the truth. Whatever lay in her pouch had already begun to change her life, and not in the way treasures usually do. Somewhere, unseen, something had started listening. The autumn fair was the only time the village felt like it belonged to the world beyond the mountains. Once a year, just after the harvest, the narrow roads filled with wagons painted in colors brighter than any leaf, their wheels creaking under crates of spice, bolts of cloth, and trinkets from far-off lands. The air smelled of cinnamon and roasting chestnuts, and the square rang with the cries of traders hawking wares that glittered in the dim light. Children darted between stalls, chasing each other with pockets full of candied walnuts, while the elders bartered over jars of honey and strings of dried fish. This year, the mist seemed almost festive, curling lazily over the cobblestones instead of clutching at ankles. But it also made the newcomers seem less real, their faces slipping in and out of sight. Among them was a figure who drew every glance without trying. The first thing people noticed was the crimson, rich, deep, and gleaming faintly even in shadow. It draped the stranger from shoulders to boots, the folds of the fabric moving as though stirred by a wind no one else could feel. Then there was the mask, smooth, featureless except for the faintest suggestion of cheekbones and a mouth, painted in muted gold. No one could tell if the eyes behind it were watching them or something far away. The traders from the lowlands were known for oddities: a comb carved from whale bone, a bottle of wine said to age backward, a scarf that never tore, but this masked one sold nothing from a table or a cart. Instead, they moved slowly through the crowd, pausing to speak in a voice low and warm, offering things no one had thought could be traded. "I will give gold," the figure murmured to a seamstress with trembling hands, "for what cannot be bought." To an old man sitting on a bench, "I can grant you the strength you had at 20, for a fair price." And to a farmer's wife who stared too long, "I will take only what you can spare and leave you with more than you dreamed." The words left a strange taste in the air, like smoke and honey. Most people laughed nervously and stepped away, clutching their baskets tighter. A few lingered too long, their eyes darting between the masked figure's robes and the heavy pouch of coins at their belt. Mira might have ignored the crimson stranger entirely if not for the way they turned toward her without hesitation, as though they had been waiting for her. She felt the weight of that gaze, whether real or imagined, before they spoke. "You," they said, their voice carrying effortlessly over the chatter of the square. "You have the eyes that see truth." The words were not a question. They were an assessment, an unveiling. Conversations nearby faltered and heads turned. Mira felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her face still. She had never heard the phrase before, yet it fit too well, like a secret she hadn't known was hers until someone spoke it aloud. "I don't know what you mean," she replied carefully, shifting her weight as if ready to leave. The mask tilted, and she had the uneasy sense of being measured, weighed like fruit in a market stall. Truth, the figure said softly, is rarer than gold. And far more costly. Something in their tone made Mira want to take a step back, but her feet stayed rooted. She was suddenly aware of how close the mist had drawn in the last few moments, coiling at her knees like a cat. The figure did not reach for her, yet the space between them felt fragile, like spun glass. Others in the crowd began to murmur, questions about who she was, what her eyes could do. She caught snatches of their words, threaded with greed. The gemstone in her pouch seemed to grow heavier, its warmth seeping into her palm through the cloth. She realized, with a sharpness that made her pulse quicken, that the crimson figure wasn't simply curious. They were hunting. And in their mind she was already marked. The harvest moon hung low that night, swollen and golden, its light filtering through the mist like something strained through honey. Mira had been weaving late into the evening when the knock came, soft but urgent. When she opened the door, she found Lisa standing there, cheeks flushed, hair clinging damp to her temples. Lisa had been her closest friend since childhood, the one who used to plait her hair by the river, the one who had once stolen apples with her from old Marek's cart. "Mira," she panted, "I need your help. My brother's gone missing in the forest. I think he's hurt." There was no question in Myra's mind. She didn't stop to grab her shawl or a lantern. She simply stepped out into the cool night, matching Lisa's quick pace. The moon lit the path in patches, silver on the damp leaves, but the mist swallowed most of the light. Lisa spoke little, her words clipped, her gaze fixed ahead. They left the last of the cottages behind, the ground softening underfoot, the air thickening. Myra's unease began as a whisper. Why had no one else been sent to look for him? Why had Lisa come to her and not the elders? But her loyalty pushed such thoughts aside. They crossed the old wooden bridge, its boards groaning under their weight, and entered the deeper woods where the trees grew close enough to muffle the world. It was there the mist parted just enough to reveal a figure in crimson, standing as still as a carved idol. Mira stopped. The harvest moon found a way through the branches to catch on the mask, turning its painted gold into something molten. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low, though her heart had already begun its furious pounding. Lisa's breath came in shallow bursts. She wouldn't meet Myra's eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered and stepped aside. The masked trader moved forward, slow and deliberate, the folds of crimson whispering against the undergrowth. "Some truths," they murmured, "are too precious to be left in wandering hands." Mira reached instinctively for the gemstone in her pouch, but the figure's gloved hand rose, not to strike, but to gesture almost reverently. "Your eyes," they said as if naming something holy. The forest held its breath. The trader closed the space between them, and for an instant Mira thought she might run, but Lisa's hands, trembling but firm, pressed her shoulders down to her knees. "It will be quick," Lisa said as though that were comfort. The crimson figure knelt before her, and from their sleeve drew a narrow length of black cloth, embroidered with symbols that seemed to move when touched by moonlight. They wrapped it around Myra's head, covering her eyes, plunging her into the scent of strange herbs and old smoke. She felt the warmth of gloved fingers at her temples, the way they lingered as though memorizing her. It was not pain as she had expected, not a tearing, not even a sharpness, but a pulling, deep and slow, as though something at the very root of her being was being unwound. She saw, behind the darkness of the cloth, flashes. A river lit with gold, the faces of her parents smiling, a crow with white eyes, the harvest moon bleeding into shadow. The warmth in her pouch flared like a heartbeat and then dimmed. She felt suddenly lighter, emptied, as if the space behind her brow had been left open for the mist to fill. The cloth was removed and her eyes were open. She knew they were, but there was nothing. No shapes, no color, only the black that lives behind closed lids. Yet before the darkness swallowed her completely, one final image burned itself into her memory, the mask tilting in quiet satisfaction, the suggestion of a smile in the painted mouth, and just beyond it, Lisa's face, pale, eyes wide, tears catching the moonlight as her hands still trembled. And then it was gone. The trader's footsteps faded into the hush of the forest, Lisa's retreating steps quickened as if fleeing her own shadow, and Mira was left kneeling in the damp leaves. The mist closed in, cool and damp against her skin, wrapping her in a silence that was no longer the comfort of childhood but the deep, aching silence of the abandoned. She did not know how long she knelt there, hearing only the thud of her own pulse and the slow drip of water from the trees. When at last she rose, she could not tell east from west, nor the path from the undergrowth. The darkness did not change no matter where she turned. Somewhere far off, an owl called, its voice bending through the trees like a question she could not answer. And Mira began to walk, one hand outstretched, into a night that had no end. The forest was a tangle of damp earth and unseen branches, each step an act of faith. Mira moved slowly, hands sweeping before her like the feelers of an insect, the chill of the night clinging to her skin. The darkness was not empty, it was heavy, a living thing pressing close, its weight growing with every breath. Somewhere ahead, she caught the faint murmur of water, the kind that shifts in tone as the land slopes away. She turned toward it, drawn by that silver thread of sound. The forest floor rose and dipped beneath her feet. Sometimes she tripped on roots, other times she stumbled into soft moss that smelled faintly of rain. The moon, the trees, the path, she could no longer picture them, but the water's voice was constant, urging her forward. Her thoughts scattered, slipping between the present and the edges of memory. She saw Lisa's face again, shimmering behind her closed eyelids, but it kept changing, at times the face of a stranger, at times her mother's, sometimes her own reflected back in dark glass. The mask floated in and out, its painted gold mouth curling into shapes she couldn't read. She thought she heard her father's voice calling her name, only to realize it was the wind moving through the high branches. The sound of the river grew louder until it was no longer a murmur but a rushing, like silk tearing endlessly. She crouched at the edge, the spray cold against her cheeks. The current's voice was layered, a deep, steady rumble beneath a sharper, bubbling treble, and somewhere within it a faint hiss, as though the water was whispering to itself. She didn't hear the old woman approach, she only became aware of another presence when a hand, warm and dry, rested lightly on her shoulder. Mira startled, half-turning, but the woman's grip was steady. "You've come far for someone with no eyes," the woman said, her voice like old bark and flowing water together. Mira swallowed. "I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. Sometimes it's just between walking and lying down in the dirt." The hand withdrew, and Mira heard the crunch of the woman lowering herself to sit beside her. "Tell me, what do you hear?" "The river," Mira answered. "Only the river?" Mira frowned, tilting her head. She let her breath slow, trying to listen past the rush. She began to notice other things, the soft pop of bubbles as they broke on the surface, the uneven plink of water hitting a hollow stone, the faint groan of a branch swaying above them. Beneath it all was a rhythm she hadn't noticed, the steady thud of her own heart. "You hear shadows," the woman said as if Mira had spoken aloud. "Not the kind your villagers fear, the ones cast by light. These shadows are the spaces between truth and lies. They are always there, but the sighted rarely notice them, too busy staring at the surface of things. I don't understand." "You will. The world speaks in more than colors and shapes. Every truth leaves an echo, every lie leaves a dent in the air. You can learn to follow them if you stop reaching for what your eyes once gave you." The woman took Myra's hands and placed them on the ground. "Feel that? The earth tells you where it's been touched. The stones tell you what's passed over them. The air tells you who was here before you." At first Mira felt only the grit of dirt and the coolness of stone. But then, with her attention sharpened, she caught the faint vibration of the river through the soil, the warmth where the woman's legs had been moments before she shifted. It was as though the world was leaving fingerprints everywhere, waiting to be read. "How can I find my way like this?" Mira asked. "You already are," the woman replied. "You came to the river, didn't you? Now you must learn to walk through shadows as though they were light." When Mira turned toward the voice again, the hand was gone. The woman's presence dissolved into the hiss of the water, leaving only the sense that she had been more spirit than flesh. Yet the lesson lingered, settling in Myra's bones. The dark was not empty. It was full, and if she listened it would show her the path. At first it was clumsy work, this new way of moving through the world. Mira would catch the edge of a table with her hip or misjudge the distance to a doorway, but each mistake was a lesson. She began to notice how the air shifted differently around open spaces than it did near walls. Her feet learned to read the ground, the spring of grass, the give of mud, the hollowness of planks over a crawl space. The river became her teacher. Each morning she returned to its bank, closing her mind to the temptation of imagining colors or shapes, and instead diving into sound and feel. She learned how water struck different stones with different voices, how a single leaf caught in the current added a thin, flickering note. She learned the sound of her own breath when she was calm, and how it changed when her heartbeat quickened with fear. It was in the stillness between those sounds that she began to hear something else, the tremor in a person's voice when they lied. At first it was faint, like a hairline crack in glass. But the more she listened, the clearer it became, not only in voices but in the way bodies moved. She could feel the uneven weight in a handshake when someone was holding something back, hear the sharp pause between words when greed swelled in a person's chest. She began to travel farther from the river, testing her sharpened senses. In the marketplace, she could tell which sellers spoke truth about their wares and which wrapped their words in silk to hide the rot beneath. A man claiming his apples were from his own orchard reeked faintly of wet straw, a scent she had learned belonged to the stalls at the far end of the road, where fruit was bought in bulk, not grown. She could tell when someone was staring at her too long, even from behind, because the air seemed to narrow, growing warmer on the back of her neck. The village, once blurred by mist, was now a clamor of layers. The sigh of a door opening on unoiled hinges, the shuffle of coins passed beneath a table, the quick inhale of someone about to speak a half-truth. It was louder, sharper, richer than sight had ever given her. And in that loudness she began to hear them. The traders. Not just the crimson figure from the fair but others, voices with the same slow cadence, the same way of letting silence stretch just long enough to pull a listener closer. She overheard them in the corners of taverns speaking of clients and collections, of delicate removals and deliveries. They spoke as though eyes were not parts of a living soul, but commodities, rare gems to be plucked and sold to those wealthy enough to afford them. One night, lingering near the edge of the square, Mira caught the faint ring of a familiar tone, the masked trader's voice. It was quieter than she remembered, but it carried the same dangerous warmth. "She's still alive," they said to someone else. "That could be a problem," another voice replied, dry and smooth as parchment. "Not yet. She has something else. I felt it before we took the eyes. It's still with her." Myra's fingers closed around the pouch at her hip. The gemstone pulsed faintly as though stirred by the memory of their words. She withdrew into an alley and slid the stone into her palm. Its warmth deepened the longer she held it, until she could feel a faint thrum in her fingertips. She had never truly studied it before, fear had kept her from it, but now, with her mind sharpened, she noticed something strange. The thrum changed when she thought of different people. She pictured the old baker and the stone stayed steady. She thought of Lisa and it flared hot enough to sting. A test. She imagined the masked trader, and the stone's beat became erratic, almost like laughter. The old woman's words at the river returned to her. Every truth leaves an echo, every lie leaves a dent in the air. Perhaps this stone was made for such a task. Not merely a treasure but a key, one that could reveal the truth others tried to bury. Her thoughts darted like fish. If the traders wanted this stone, it meant they feared what it could uncover. If they feared it, then it was her one advantage. But it also meant that as long as she carried it, they would not stop hunting her. She closed her fingers around it and tucked it back into its pouch. The gemstone was hers now and she would not give it up, not until she understood its full power. The darkness might have taken her sight, but it had given her something else, the ability to see through shadows. And she would use it to look straight into the heart of the people who had stolen her eyes. The road back to the village was the same one she had stumbled along blind on that first night, yet it felt different now. She no longer reached for shapes she couldn't see, she followed the pull of familiar sounds, the hollow ring of her steps on the bridge, the low hum of the wind passing between two leaning cottages, the scent of hearth smoke curling over the rooftops. The mist clung to her as if recognizing her, sliding around her ankles in slow coils. She came at dusk, when the noise of the square softened into the creak of shutters and the faint clatter of dishes. Keeping to the edges, she moved like part of the fog, her steps quiet enough to pass unnoticed. She hadn't planned to enter her old home so soon, but her feet found their way there without asking her mind. The door gave its old sigh when she pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and faint lavender. The sachets she'd hung years ago were still working. She could feel the table where she'd left it, the uneven patch on the floor where a knot had worked loose in the wood. But there were new things too, a set of boots in the corner that weren't hers, a small stack of folded linen smelling faintly of someone else's soap. She froze at the sound of voices outside just beyond the window. The glass was thin enough for her to catch every word. "Told you it's her. I saw her shadow near the square." "That's impossible. She's gone, she's been gone since the harvest moon." "Then why has the mist been thicker these weeks?" "It's a curse. She was taken for a reason, and now she's come back to bring it on us all." The other voice lowered to a whisper, so soft Mira had to hold her breath to hear. "If she's truly back, the traders will know. They'll come again." Their footsteps retreated, swallowed by the damp air. Mira stayed still a moment longer, her fingers resting on the pouch at her hip. A curse? That's what they had made of her absence. Easier than speaking of betrayal. She moved deeper into the cottage, the room's layout familiar enough to navigate without thought. Her hand brushed the chair by the hearth, and she caught a faint trace of perfume, sharp, expensive, the kind only the traders brought up from the lowlands. It was a scent she remembered from that night in the forest. Lisa's scent. Mira didn't have to imagine the rest. Word of Lisa's sudden wealth had reached even her ears during her cautious visits to neighboring villages. The jingle of coin, the new fabrics rustling when she walked. Yet the air told other stories. She had overheard a farmer muttering that Lisa hardly slept, that she stared at nothing for hours, lips pressed white. That night, Mira lingered near the tavern, hidden in the space between its wall and the smithy next door. The laughter inside spilled out into the street, muddled by ale, but she filtered it away until she caught Lisa's voice. "Don't speak of her. She was your friend." She was. Lisa stopped, and Mira could almost feel the weight pressing against her chest. "She looked at me that night before." A pause. "I thought it would be different. I thought it wouldn't feel like this." The other person murmured something Mira couldn't catch, and the conversation dissolved into the clatter of mugs. Mira stepped back into the mist, her pulse steady. She had come expecting the sharp taste of vengeance in her mouth, but instead there was something else, clearer, colder. Revenge would only close the circle the traders had drawn around the village. What she wanted now was not their pain, but their truth, laid bare where all could see it. She thought of the gemstone's heat in her palm, the way it pulsed stronger when a lie was near. It would be her torch in the shadows, the thing that turned whispers into shouts. She would not come at them with a blade, they would see her coming and strike first. No, she would unmask them in the place they felt safest, under the eyes of those they sought to control. In her mind, she began to weave it as she once wove cloth, each thread a sound she had heard, a truth she had felt. The harvest moon had taken her eyes, but the next gathering would give her something far greater, the power to make the village see. The winter feast was the only time the village forgot its mist. Lanterns burned bright in the square, their light fighting to hold back the fog, and the hall at the center overflowed with heat, music, and the sharp scent of spiced cider. Every face was turned toward the long tables, where venison steamed and bread lay in golden loaves. This was the night when old grudges were shelved, or at least tucked neatly beneath napkins, and people pretended that the year had been kinder than it was. Mira slipped among them like the ghost they believed her to be. Her feet were silent on the frost-hardened ground, the sounds guiding her, the uneven beat of a drunkard's tapping foot, the sway of skirts against a chair leg, the greedy hush of someone leaning too close to a platter. She waited until the hall had settled into the lull that comes after the first round of drinking, when laughter droops into low conversation and the music softens. Then she stepped into the center of the floor. The first gasp cut through the chatter. Her hood fell back, and though her eyes were clouded white, there was nothing vacant about her face. The gemstone burned faintly in her palm, its warmth traveling up her arm, making the air around her hum. The murmurs began. Her name passed from one mouth to another like a secret too dangerous to keep. "I've come," she said, her voice steady, "to return what you gave me." The words alone might have drawn ridicule, but the glow from her hand seemed to draw every gaze. And then the stone pulsed, once, twice, and with each beat, the air around certain people grew heavier, visible to her as dark ripples in her shadow sight. She turned toward the baker, who flinched before she spoke. "You knead your dough with one hand while pocketing the coin meant for the widow's loaves." The man's lips parted in protest, but the ripple of heat around him flared, confirming the lie he was about to tell. Gasps followed her words. Someone muttered, "How could she know?" She moved to the next, the miller's wife, her fine necklace still smelling faintly of lowland perfume. "You tell your neighbors you barter grain for cloth, yet your grain goes to the traders, and your cloth comes soaked in another's blood." The woman's sharp inhale was answer enough. One by one she laid bare the small and great betrayals of the past year. Her voice carried the quiet precision of someone weaving a net, each word a knot, each revelation another strand tightening around the room. The stone in her hand blazed hotter with every truth, its light spilling through her fingers like molten gold. Then a colder heat brushed her senses, familiar, sharp, and wrong. She turned her head toward the far end of the hall, where the merchants sat. The music had stopped altogether now, replaced by the collective breath of the crowd. "I know you," she said, though she could not see him. Her shadow sight painted him in lines of cold fire, and she could feel the mask's edges as if they were pressed into her own skin. "You sell your wares with smiles and silk, but you have sold something else, your soul, long before you came here." He laughed, the sound low and smooth, but she heard the crack in it. The gemstone's glow surged, and for the first time she saw not in shadows, but in a blinding flare of truth. The mask melted away in her mind's eye, revealing a face lined with bitterness, familiar in a way that tightened her chest. "You were one of us," she whispered. "Exiled for stealing from the sick and the hungry. You left with nothing, and returned with a mask to hide your shame." A murmur of recognition swept the hall. The elders shifted in their seats, recalling the young man who had been cast out decades ago. He rose to his feet, but the crowd had already begun to turn, the air thick with anger and the metallic tang of betrayal. "You let them take from us," Mira said, her voice rising above the noise. "Our coin, our trust, our eyes. And you paid them with the only thing you had left, your honor." The traitors at his side shifted uneasily as the crowd pressed forward. The warmth in Myra's palm burned bright enough now to spill light over the floor, catching on the merchant's silks, turning them gaudy in the eyes of those who had once coveted them. Someone shouted for the door to be barred. Another voice called for the traitors to be searched. The man in crimson's composure cracked at last. "You blind fool," he spat, "you think you've freed them? You've doomed them. There are others, more powerful than you can imagine." "Let them come," she replied. "They'll find no more buyers here." With that, the hall erupted, not in chaos but in unity. Villagers who had sat on opposite sides of feuds now stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the merchant's path. Hands reached for the goods on the tables, tossing coins and baubles into the fire. The masked man was dragged toward the door, the heat of the gemstone in Myra's hand dimming to a warm, steady thrum. She knew the fight wasn't over. The network he had spoken of was real and it would come searching. But for tonight, the village had seen what it had refused to see for decades. And seeing at last was enough to begin. The hall still thrummed with the echoes of shouting when Mira raised her hand, the gemstone's fading warmth urging her to speak before anger turned to blood. Her voice cut through the tension like a cold wind, sharp enough to still the crowd without needing to shout. "No blades," she said. "No hangings. Not tonight." The villagers looked at her in disbelief. Some still clutched makeshift weapons, wooden ladles, carving knives, a length of chain from the stable. She could hear the quickened breath of those eager for retribution, the kind that would leave stains on the floor for years to come. "They've taken enough from us," Mira continued. "Do not give them more by becoming like them." She stepped toward the masked traitor, feeling his presence like a shadow pressed too close. "You will not die here," she told him, "but you will not leave untouched." The villagers tightened their ring, their boots scraping against the wooden planks as they closed in. Mira reached for the oath, something older than the traitor's greed, older than the village itself. Words not taught but remembered, as if the river spirit had whispered them to her in dreams. "You will never take eyes again," she said, her voice slow and deliberate, each word like a stone placed in a wall. "Not by theft, not by trade, not by trickery. You will carry the hunger for them all your days but never feed it." She placed her hand, gemstone and all, over the center of his mask. The glow seeped into the wood, then into the skin beneath, and when she withdrew, the mark of her hand lingered, faint but undeniable. He staggered back, clutching his face, and she knew the oath would cling to him like a scent, warning others before he even spoke. Then she turned to her betrayer. The air between them was brittle, as if a single breath might shatter it. Mira could hear the tremor in the woman's heartbeat, the way shame made her smaller without anyone needing to touch her. "I trusted you," Mira said simply. The weight of the words was heavier than any curse. Her friend, no, the stranger she had once called friend, opened her mouth, but whatever excuse she had prepared shriveled in the air. I thought," she began, but Mira tilted her head, listening not to the words but to the tone, the hollow space where truth should be. "You thought gold would keep you warm at night," Mira said. "But it won't. Not now. Not here." The villagers waited for her judgment. Mira did not raise her voice. "You will walk away from this place tonight. You will take nothing but the clothes on your back. And wherever you go, you will carry the story of what you did, because people will see it in your eyes before you speak." There was no protest this time. Only the sound of boots on the floor as her betrayer left the circle, each step slower than the last. The door opened, spilling cold mist into the hall, and then closed behind her, leaving the air a little lighter. Mira turned the gemstone over in her palm. Its light was faint now, like an ember on the edge of sleep. She could feel the river calling it home. "It was never mine," she murmured, and the crowd parted as she made her way to the door. The villagers followed her in silence through the mist-wrapped streets, their torches swaying like small suns. The river's voice grew louder with each step, a constant rushing that matched the pulse of her own heart. At the bank, she crouched, feeling the cold breath of the water on her face. "You gave it to me when I was blind," she whispered to the current. "Now I see enough to give it back." She let the stone slip from her fingers. It hit the water with a soft, almost tender sound, and for an instant the current glowed where it vanished. Then the light was gone, carried away toward places she would never follow. When she rose, the mist felt thinner, as though the village itself had drawn its first clear breath in years. There was no cheer, no triumphant cry. Only a quiet respect in the way they stepped aside to let her pass, as if they understood that justice could be sharper when it left no scars. That night, no one slept easily. The trader was escorted to the edge of the valley and set on a road no one dared to follow. The woman who had once been Myra's friend vanished into the fog, her footsteps swallowed long before anyone thought to look back. By dawn, the mist had closed over their trails. But the village remembered, and this time the memory was not of greed, but of the night they were given the choice to kill and chose instead to change. The years passed, and the story of that winter night seeped into the bones of the valley like the ever-present mist. People no longer spoke of the girl who lost her eyes, but of the woman who had returned with a vision far deeper than sight. They called her the Shadow Seer. She lived in a small hut at the edge of the river, where the water's voice was always near, speaking in currents and whispers only she seemed to understand. The villagers, once driven by greed and vanity, came to her not for trade or trinkets but for counsel. Travelers from far-off towns sought her wisdom, carrying tales of her across mountains and forests. Some came asking about love, others about betrayal, and a few about the way to live without regret. Mira welcomed them all. She listened more than she spoke, her face tilted toward each voice, her hands resting lightly on the worn wood of her chair. Those who came expecting a prophet's thunder found instead a quiet certainty, as if she could feel the truth of their hearts before they uttered a word. When she answered, it was never in riddles or grand pronouncements. She spoke plainly the way the river does when it runs clear. Children, curious about her blindness, would sometimes ask, "Do you ever wish to see again?" Mira would smile, a small knowing curve of the lips, and reply, "I see all I need to." In time they stopped asking, sensing there was no loss in her answer, only peace. The merchants never returned to the valley, though Mira knew others like them still roamed the lowlands. She felt their presence in the tremor of distant rumors, but she did not chase them. Her work was not to fight every shadow in the world, but to teach others to recognize when light had been stolen from them. In her presence, people found themselves confessing things they had never spoken aloud. Some wept, some laughed, and some left in silence, carrying away more than they had brought. They said her blindness stripped away the masks they wore, because she never mistook a handsome face for a kind soul, or a lovely smile for an honest one. She never remarried, never sought wealth, and never again kept secrets that could poison the heart. Her life was simple: a garden, the river, and the steady rhythm of footsteps from those seeking her counsel. Sometimes, in the quiet after visitors had gone, she would sit by the water and let her fingers trail along the current, feeling the smooth stones beneath. Somewhere down there the gemstone still rested, its truth no longer hers to carry. One autumn evening, when the mist was low and the sun bled gold across the water, Mira walked along the riverbank. Her cane tapped the earth in a steady beat, her bare feet sensing the subtle warmth where the sun still touched the soil. The shadows of the trees stretched long and thin across her path, but as she approached, they seemed to draw back, leaving the way clear before her. Those who saw her that night swore the mist moved aside for her as well, parting just enough for her to walk without pause. Some said it was magic, others that it was merely the wind. But the older villagers, the ones who remembered the market of eyes and the winter feast, knew better. For in the valley, it had become a truth as certain as the river's flow. Sight without truth is blindness, but blindness with truth is sight. And so Mira walked on, her face turned toward the sound of the water, the darkness around her no prison but a companion. The shadows parted before her, not out of fear but out of respect, for they knew she had once been their prisoner and had learned to walk free.